Thank you so much. So everybody, thank you for being with us here today and throughout the conference. And thank you especially to JDC for organizing this conference. It's my great pleasure to introduce Ana Maria Ibanez. Ana Maria is a principal advisor at the Inter-American Development Bank. She coordinates all the knowledge agenda that's being developed at the bank right now, including some groundbreaking work on displacement in Latin America. She's also a full professor on leave and a former dean of economics at the school at the Universidad de los Andes in Colombia. On a personal note, I'm very excited to have Ana Maria here. I started my career as a research assistant for Ana Maria back in 2004, I think. Ana Maria is actually the one of the persons that motivated me to go into a PhD and has supported me throughout my career. So I'm grateful and indebted to her and her support. She's also one of the nicest persons I've ever met. But also from an academic perspective, Ana Maria, I can say without a doubt, is a trailblazer. I think it's very nice that we here are convening for the second time to talk about forced displacement over 3 days. That we have kind of a upgrowing community of people that are interested in these topics, that are working hard to gather more data, knowledge, and evidence so that we can support and improve the lives of thousands of millions of displaced persons worldwide. And it's nice to see that this is happening now. It's nice to see all the interest. It wasn't the case before, and for many years, displacement was sort of a neglected topic, especially in economics. And this is unfortunate. But Ana Maria actually started working on this back in early 2000. In 2002, she collected the first data that was collected, microdata in Colombia, a survey on displaced populations and non-displaced populations, trying to understand drivers of displacement and the consequences of displacement. Then in 2004, she collected the first nationally representative survey for displaced persons in Colombia that has been used in different papers, that has been used in different policy studies. And actually, she has made substantial contributions not only in academia, but also to policy making. If you go and look all the different rulings by the Constitutional Court in Colombia, all the different laws, for instance, the victims law that Paula Gaviria was mentioning 2 days ago, you always find references to her work. So Ana Maria actually has been a pioneer in all these studies. And I think it's fitting for this conference that we're ending on a high note and having her here. So without further ado, Ana Maria, the floor is yours, and thank you for accepting the invitation to be here, and it's an honor to have you.
Andres, thank you very much for your really generous and kind words. I'm really excited to be here. Let me share my screen. So first, I would like to congratulate the organizers of the event, the Joint Data Center on Forced Displacement, the World Bank, and dear Universidad de los Andes for organizing this event. And also thank you for inviting me to present today. I'm deeply honored and happy to be sharing this event with Andres, with whom I have worked for so many years already. I have been greatly enjoying the 3 days of the conference. It is really exciting to hear young scholars presenting rigorous and relevant research, the innovations on data collections and data use, and the policy discussion. During my last 23 years, I started working on displacement in 1999. I have been doing research on forced migration, and it really fills me with hope to know that so many intelligent people are putting their hearts and minds to help improve the lives of forced migrants, which is ultimately what we want to do with this research and with these types of events. So protecting forced migrants is one of the main development challenges today. It has been quite evident throughout the 3 days that this is the case. And we have heard over and over again during the conference that the extent and intensification of forced migration. Today, we have 92 million people that have been forcefully displaced, or that have been forced to migrate worldwide. And 58% of these are internally displaced persons, which is about 48 million. And what in fact this graph shows is that this increasing trend is largely driven by internally displaced persons. Differently than refugees, who are under the protection of the international community and international organizations, the protection of IDPs is really the sole responsibility of the national governments, which renders them more vulnerable given that their countries are, in the first place, facing war, conflict, and intense violence, and that's why they became displaced in the first place. So the challenges to assist internal displaced populations and help them recover from the shock brought by forced migration are manifold. And from years of trials on public policies and research, we know that we require at least like 4 dimensions that are very important and where we still have a lot of knowledge to gather and to collect. The first one is that definitely policies need to move beyond humanitarian assistance to development aid. What we have found so far after many decades is that displaced and refugees are highly reliant on government aid, and they are not able to really recover their capacity to generate income, to be independent, and to not need this government aid. Secondly, really we need governments, we require governments and international organizations to design comprehensive policies and legal frameworks. And I stress legal frameworks because it's very important to protect IDPs and the refugees with a legal framework, and you will see in a bit why I say that. And of course, implementing evidence-based policy and programs to promote the recovery of economic, social, and psychological capacities of the IDP is crucial. So we really need this evidence to design policies that are quite challenging and programs that are quite challenging because it's not a traditional development program. And ultimately, what we want is to aim for the successful integration into the host communities of the population. There is no doubt that the challenges are really enormous because there is not a one-fit-all solution. Context matters, and it matters a lot. But we really need then policymakers, practitioners, victim organizations, researchers, and other organizations to work together to improve the life of forced migrants. So the purpose of the paper that I'm going to present today seeks to contribute to the literature that we have on forced displacement and especially on internal displacement by reviewing really a salient case study of forced migration, which is Colombia. We discussed forced displacement in the country, the response of the state, and the contribution of the academic community to refine the policies to protect the IDP population. And I must confess that we decided to write this paper when the GDC decided to organize this conference in Colombia. By that time, we hoped that it was going to be not virtual, but that we will all be in Colombia, but unfortunately, we could not do it. But that's why we decided to write this paper, and I'm so glad really that Andres proposed the idea and pushed us forward. And we decided to write this review because we believe Colombia really provides consequential lessons to other countries with high flows of internally displaced persons, of refugees. And why is that so? First, Colombia has the largest internally displaced population in the world. We have about 8 million people that have been displaced since 1985. And this is because the country has faced 2 large waves of displacement during the 20th century. And this has led to a rich experience crafting policies to protect the IDP population. But I must stress that to protect the IDP population in receiving destinations and not so in hometowns, so not to prevent displacement. In parallel, what we have seen is that the government, researchers, and practitioners have collected several micro-level datasets. So it has been policy that has been informed by data and by quantitative and qualitative analysis that has been done by social researchers for many decades. And this data has been designed for policy planning and research. So interestingly, we have a long process of trial and error in policy making that has been fed from the academic research of social scientists and several organizations, but also, and very importantly so, us as academic researchers have fed also from the policy questions that policymakers have posed. So Colombia, sadly for us Colombians, is a policy lab from which to draw lessons that can inform other countries that are facing similar processes. For displacement, like in many other countries facing conflict, is a deliberate war strategy of armed groups to further their war objectives. It's seldom the case that forced displacement is an unintended byproduct of violence, but most of the times it's a deliberate war strategy of armed groups. And given the pervasive conflict in Colombia, we have suffered two large waves of forced displacement, as I already mentioned, in the 20th century and now in the 21st century. The first wave happened between 1948 and 1958, and it displaced around 10% of the population. And this might be really an underestimation because the data by that time is not really good. And the current one has displaced 16% of the Colombian population. To further their objectives, some groups target civilians. And as I say, they target civilians deliberately. And this is unfortunately a very effective strategy for armed groups to strengthen their territorial strongholds. Territorial control is crucial in an armed conflict. To seize valuable assets from the civilian population for the loot, but also to fund the war activities. And in the case of Colombia, they have seized valuable assets such as land in a massive way. It's also effective to prevent civil resistance by violently controlling the population and also to weaken the support of the population to the opponent groups. But attacks to the population are not only a war strategy, but armed groups many times deliberately attack certain groups of the population. So violence is not indiscriminate. It's targeted to some specific groups to really further the war objectives that they are looking for. So in a data that we collected with Stephanie Engel in 1999, we found that this was the case. And we found that the displaced in Colombia were mainly rural population, and this is because the war was happening in rural areas, but also that landowners were targeted, mostly informal ones, but not necessarily with the smaller land plots, and this is related to seizing land. Community leaders were attacked disproportionately, and this is because they are highly visible in the community, and thus attacking them steals fears in the population, and it's easier to control the population. And also households with dense social networks and therefore more visible in the community. Therefore, the lion's share of the dead in most armed conflicts are civilians and not combatants. And Colombia is not the exception. A report by the Centro Nacional de Memoria Histórica shows that 82% of total conflict-related deaths were civilians and not combatants. And also victimization was massive in Colombia. We have 9.2 million officially recognized victims, currently recognized by the government through the victims law. And this implies that a little more than 1 out of every 6 Colombians are today victims of conflict. And the great majority of those are internally displaced persons, which are rightfully recognized as victims by the victims law passed in 2011. The extent of victimization of the displaced population suffered is significant. In a survey we did in 2005 with Klaus Deininger, Andres Moya, and Paulo Querubin, we inquired about the immediate cause of displacement. And the figures are staggering. 55% of the displaced moved because they received a direct threat. 35% had been victims of homicide. Some household members had been killed, and that's why they displaced. 36% because they left because of an armed confrontation in their hometown, and 21% because of a massacre. So the IDPs not only has had to face all the trauma that fleeing hastily implies, but also were direct victims of violence in large numbers. So around 85% of displaced of the population in Colombia, of displaced population in Colombia, moved as a reaction to a direct victimization, while 15% migrated to prevent being a victim of migration in the future. And differently than in other countries that are facing forced migration, migration in Colombia is not geographically clustered and confined just at some regions of the country. As you can see in this map, it is widespread in the Colombian territory. And what you can see is that all Colombian municipalities have had a forced displacement. And also differently than most countries with forced migration, people migrate mostly individually and do not locate in camps, which makes it very difficult and a challenge for the provision of aid, but it's hugely important for migrants to be able to integrate into their host community. The empirical evidence on the consequences of forced displacement in Colombia is ample. Forced displacement seems to thrust IDP into poverty. In this graph, what we do is that we use data from different sources to illustrate the trend in poverty rates for IDPs and the Colombian population. And what you can see, I'm going to focus on the graph on the left, which is for poverty, and this one is for extreme poverty. In 2005, what we found is that 90% of the population were poor. In 2008 and 2010, the figures were quite similar. Really, poverty rates for IDP remained stagnant while decreasing for the Colombian population. You cannot see the decrease well because of the scale of the graph, but it was falling for the rest of the Colombian population. By 2014, in spite of the increasing support from the national government, poverty rates for the IDP were 64%, which implied that IDPs had 1.7 times and 3.7 times were more likely to be poor and extremely poor relative to the national averages. And although we cannot claim causality, there is some evidence that points in that direction. First, data from the survey that we collected in 2005 finds that before migrating, IDP enjoyed better living conditions and were less vulnerable than the average rural household. Remember that they were mostly rural. And in addition, as this graph illustrates, income and consumption dropped sharply right after displacement. And after a year, it had really not recovered from the migration shock very much. And this really persists for many, many years, in spite of the government support to mitigate the shock. The erosion of their asset base, which is, we broadly understand this asset base in the paper to encompass productive, physical, human, social, and psychological assets, may push households into poverty traps, which are difficult to overcome without the government support. I have always find this picture, that this picture is really a devastating testimony of the hastiness when fleeing violence and the huge asset loss it entails. So I just wanted to show it to you. What is the evidence of this multidimensional asset loss? Well, this evidence is ample, and it's from many, many sources, including administrative data on land losses. First, IDP suffer a substantial and permanent loss of physical and productive assets. 2/3 had access to land before migrating, and the majority, most, derived their livelihoods from agricultural activity. There was, as I say, a massive illegal land seizure in Colombia using administrative data from the Colombian government. We estimate in a paper with several colleagues that the total land lost by IDP was 7.3 million hectares. Is that large? Yes, it is very, very large. It's about 29% of the land suitable for agriculture in Colombia. Second, IDP in Colombia have not been able to compensate for the asset loss with labor income once in destination. This is because their capital, their human capital depreciates as well. And it depreciates first because they face a depreciation of their occupation-specific skills. Remember that most of them were agricultural workers, and they don't have the skills to compete in urban labor market. But also they face the death of the main household breadwinner or the people in the productive years in the household. Remember that about 35% had to migrate because of homicide in the family. And many children drop out when they reach 12 years of age. When they arrive to that age, the likelihood or the risk of dropping out increases significantly. So as a result, what we find is that unemployment rates are larger than the urban population of similar characteristics. And this gap persists, even though it decreases, it persists through time. Another important thing is that there is a disruption of their social networks and social capital. Given the large multiple market failures that displaced face, in particular the lack of access to risk coping mechanisms such as formal financial markets, this loss increases their vulnerability to negative income shock. So what we have is that this multidimensional asset loss hinders the ability of IDP to cope with shocks, to recover from the shock, and to secure livelihoods. Therefore, it increases the risk of falling into poverty traps and into chronic poverty. I really don't want to dwell more on the consequences of forced displacement, which are manifold. I just want to stress one that I find particularly important, and it's really better policies to address this. Forced displacement takes a huge toll on mental health. The trauma caused by forced displacement and the victimization they endure before migrating results in psychological disorders such as chronic anxiety, severe depression, and post-traumatic disorders. A paper by Andres Moya, which was a pioneering paper, documents that the incident at risk symptoms of anxiety and depression is 3 and 4 times larger among IDP than the general Colombian population. And as this graph illustrates, it shows that 27% of victims are at risk of developing severe anxiety. So you can imagine recovering from the large economic shock caused by forced displacement while facing psychological disorder. This is, to say the least, a difficult challenge. Now, let me go to what has done Colombia, which I think is important for other countries. The Colombian state has developed a progressive legislation to assist the victims of forced migration. These policies were designed and implemented amid conflict, which is quite interesting because most countries wait until the conflict is over and then they start supporting and aiding victims and forced migrants. The policies have really evolved through a trial and error process with a strong involvement of the 3 state branches, and you will see in a minute why this is important: international organization, academic researchers, and most importantly, victims organization. The first piece of legislation to assist the IDP, which is really quite surprising, was enacted in 1953. It was a decree which main purpose was to promote the return of the IDP to their hometown and to provide credits for housing reconstruction. And as George mentioned in the welcoming address of this conference, politics, and I'm going to state that throughout the presentation, is an integral part of the policy discussion to address the needs of the displaced population. In this particular case, the policy enacted was a small piece on a larger military strategy to establish state control on conflict regions. So they needed the population to go back to their hometown. Once peace was negotiated and a new government arrived, the government implemented peacemaking programs for reconstruction of rural areas, land restitution, and the promotion of return to the IDP to the rural areas. Interestingly, the government dubbed the IDP as exiled population, as this newspaper shows. However, the first broad piece of legislation was really enacted in 1997. By this time, no other country had drafted legislation to address the needs of IDP, but very interestingly enough, the United Nations was discussing and it approved the guiding principles on internal displacement in 1998. So it was a discussion in parallel in which the discussion of the United Nations really had an influence on the law that was enacted in 1997. And in fact, they have a lot of common traits. In this law, which was very important, the state recognized the legal status of IDPs and defined a set of policies which aim to bring them back to the conditions they had before displacement. It also created the state registry for IDP, recognized the obligation of the state to compensate them through land restitution and indemnities, and acknowledged the need to design special policies for IDPs instead of providing preferential access to anti-poverty programs. However, the law was overly ambitious. You have to bear in mind that, that when the law was approved by the Congress in 1987, the stock of IDP was near 900,000 persons. However, in the years after, the conflict intensified and the flows of IDPs intensified as well, and it grew exponentially, reaching in 2002 the peak of yearly displacement, a stock of 3.5 million people, and only that year, 7,080,000 people displaced. So the state really didn't have the capacity to implement this law. It was very difficult. In spite of the good intentions of the law, and in spite of the problems with the design, politics also played a huge role in the implementation of the law. So the new government in 2002 did not agree with the tenets of the law and basically ignored most of its provision. The government concentrated its efforts on providing IDP preferential access to anti-poverty programs while neglecting all the specific programs that the law had put in place, designed for the displaced population. Also, it actively promoted the return to their hometown. However, only 10% wanted to return. The conflict was still intense, and there was violence in most regions of the country. The Constitutional Court then weighed in, so that's why I mentioned the three branches of the government, weighed in by declaring the unconstitutional state of affairs and urged the national government and local government to protect the rights of the IDP population, forcing them to abide by the law 387. In addition, the court defined a strict schedule to monitor the progress of the IDP policies, in which it required the government to submit mandatory periodic reports. And something that was very interesting, it created an independent commission that had to apply each year a yearly representative household survey to the IDP for measuring the progress and the implementation of the law. This mandate of the Constitutional Court was very important, and it contributed significantly to strengthening the IDP policy and to improving their conditions. In 2011, the state passed the victims law, and here is the third state branch that participated in this process. This was led by Congress, not by the government, and the law was passed in 2011. Again, it was an unprecedented decision worldwide. Basically, it recognized IDP as victims of war, and that was very important. After the peace accord with FARC, the victims law became part of the transitional justice system of Colombia. The law built on existing legislation, on the previous legislation that we had, and solved some of the problems with the previous one. Two additional objectives that the law refined were the following. The first one is to define the different stages of IDP interventions from transition to cessation of the IDP legal status. Each stage covers policies designed specifically to address the needs of the IDP, but also a preferential inclusion in anti-poverty programs and social protection. And also, the second one is to specify the two mechanisms to compensate IDP for their loss: indemnities and land restitution. Arlen Guarin already presented his fascinating paper on the effect of indemnities, but basically what indemnities are is that are a one-time lump sum payment of up to maximum $10,000, which is a lot for Colombia, and is equivalent to 3.3 times the income of IDPs. The paper by Arlen shows that these indemnities have had a large positive impact on many economic and social dimensions. So the experience of Colombia leaves many consequential lessons, positive and negative, of course, to other countries that are facing large inflows of IDP, but refugees as well. I think it's important to report cases. I'm going to repeat some of them because I think it's important to have them on in just one slide. So some of the achievement of the laws, and these are not the only ones, I must say, is first that the state legally recognized IDP as a group that was legally protected by the state and recognized as victim. This was very important for the Constitutional Court to weigh in. And as such, the state is thus obliged to compensate IDPs through land restitution and indemnities, which has a huge impact, apparently, on the lives of victims. The third important thing was the state registry for IDP. It was an important step, given that IDP in Colombia are dispersed throughout the territory and not in camp as in many other countries. This instrument was crucial to identify IDPs and to estimate their potential demand for aid. The fourth important lesson is the need to design special interventions for IDP and not only provide preferential access to existing government programs. And this is crucial to tackle the multidimensional asset loss that I discussed before. This has proven to be very difficult. It has not been an easy process. It's challenging, but the Colombian government has been gradually acquiring knowledge and experience and refining these policies. Lastly, the law allowed the government to build institutional architecture that tackles all these issues. However, there are some shortcomings that really are not negligible. The first one that I already mentioned is that it was overly ambitious. In the scope, it was ambitious in the scope of the law as well as on the many dimensions it seeks to tackle. This leads also to really high expectation, the potential for broken promises, and what is very important, to a growing mistrust between IDPs and the government. The second is that the government took too long to define the criteria to seize the special protection of IDPs. And even now, the criteria, which is needs-based, is complex and difficult to accomplish. I will show it in the next slide. And this may hamper the fiscal sustainability of the law. And as Paula Gaviria mentioned, our policies disregard the prevention of further displacement episodes. It's mainly concentrated on what to do with displaced population in the receiving destinations. And displacement is today again on the rise. Last, and by no means least, politics play a really important role. As Clausewitz rightly said many decades ago, war is politics by other means. And so is peace and the assistance of victims. Providing aid and investing on the internally displaced population is a political decision which fuels a heated debate, and that has been the case in Colombia. And for us as researchers, this is important to bear in mind. Yes, of course, evidence-based policy is ideal, but evidence will not be enough when politics play such a large role. So we need to continue doing our job to show how important it is to address these problems, but politics is going to be there as well. But really do not be discouraged because of that. In Colombia, research and the use of data has been central for illustrating the extent of the problem, the needs of the IDP, and the way forward. And interestingly and important, all kinds of institutions have collected data on IDP, and very good data and very rigorous data. It has been a collective effort by the civic society, state data, through the government and the Constitutional Court, and research institution. This has allowed us to make research and to do important and interesting research, but also for the government to plan and to design good policies. And I must say, as Colombian, and after looking back while writing this paper and preparing this presentation, that I feel proud of what we have accomplished as a society, even though we have really a long way to go, and I know we have a long way to go. So the indicators of the need-based criteria show significant achievements in many dimensions. So for example, in health, we have an achievement of 94%. On identification, we have an achievement of 98%. On income generation, we have an achievement of 50%, of 60%, sorry. We have a problem with some others, like education, psychological support, and family reunification, which is weird because it's very difficult for the government to really promote that. Also, up until August of 2021, 1.1 million victims have received indemnities equivalent to 0.8 of Colombia's GDP. This is large, sizable. And up until September of 2021, there were judicial sentences for the restitution of almost 500,000 hectares. What happens with policy effectiveness? There is a lot of evidence on effectiveness of IDP policy in Colombia. And this is a section of the paper that we really need to work on. But as I mentioned before, I'm going to split it in four different topics. The first one is the state registry, which, as I mentioned before, is one of the main achievements of the Colombian policy. It allows the government to identify the IDP and plan state aid. It's a demand-driven instrument because of what I had already mentioned. The IDP are dispersed throughout the territory. What we found in a survey that we did in 2005, when the policy was still weak, is that 70% had registered on the registry, and the ones that were left out were the more vulnerable ones because of lack of information about the registry and the benefits of registering in the registry. Also, we found a low take-up of aid. So then Mariana Blanco and Juan Fernando Vargas did an RCT sending SMS messages to the IDP population to increase take-up rates, and they were successful. It increased by 12 percentage points, and the victim units decided to use this strategy. So that's important. The second evidence is for specific policies to assist the IDP, and what the evidence shows is that it really has contributed to improve the lives of IDP. First, income generation programs, income has increased, and what the evidence has shown is that the most effective ones are the ones on labor training, much more than those transfers for entrepreneurs. And also we have seen very promising results for psychosocial interventions that has positive impacts on maternal health, early childhood development, and entrepreneurship. Anti-poverty programs, they have been important, but they are quite insufficient to address all the needs of the IDP. CCTs have had a positive impact on education, health, and nutrition. And what we have found is that using the existing infrastructure is useful, but not sufficient really to guarantee aid independency. The last one, which I believe is quite promising and which Arlene already presented this morning, is the compensation policies, restitution and indemnities. What the paper by Arlene shows is that there is a large and potentially sustainable impact on economic and social outcomes, not only for this generation, but there is a large investment in education, which is very important. And beneficiaries are able to move from low-wage jobs to high-wage jobs. And a paper by Francesco Bogliacino shows that the beneficiaries of restitution are more trustworthy. So now, starting to conclude, the experience of 2 decades or 30 years of experience in Colombia provides consequential lessons. And I would say that the first consequential lessons is that we have been able to work together, government, victims organization, researchers, and the civil society. This doesn't mean that we have not discussed a lot and disagreed a lot in many times, but we have worked together to design a better policy and to do this trial and error process. The second important conclusion is that the transition from humanitarian aid to development policies is quite a bumpy road. The process is long. Policies need really to account for this multidimensional asset loss of IDP and incorporate all the complementarities between programs, such as, for example, labor training with psychosocial support. Second, and I want to stress that again, Colombia has been praised for being ambitious on its IDP policies, but however, being overly ambitious may set implausible targets sometimes, and hampering thus the credibility of the state and frustrating victims even more. And that's important to take into account. Third, and this is the last time I mentioned this, addressing the needs of victims is really a politically contentious issue, and the discussions on Colombia with regards to this topic has left really deep scars which will take years to heal. And now I really have a sobering conclusion that I think is important. In spite of all these progressive policies and the large research in Colombia, displacement is today on the rise. This year, it has increased by 200%, which is by no means good news. So ending conflict and ending violence is really the best policy option to prevent more displacement. Our role as academics showing the deep scars of conflict and displacement is instrumental. We have found that for Colombia. However, other disciplines may help better transmit emotions and empathy towards the people that are suffering. So I finished thus with two pieces of art that have moved me since I started in my life as researcher on displacement issue. The first one is this beautiful painting by Ana González Rojas. She is a Colombian painter who seeks through art to illustrate the suffering of conflict in our country. One of her collections is about dresses of IDP girls. This is one of the paintings of that collection. And I find it beautiful, moving, and shows the depth of their loss. The second one is a passage on the book by John Steinbeck, The Grapes of Wrath, about the northern-southern migration in the United States. And when I read this, I have been doing research on displacement for many years already. I thought it transmitted all the unmeasurable losses of migration. And in reading this passage, I end. How can we live without our lives? How will we know it is us without our past? How will it not be to know what's land outside the door? How if you wake up in the night and know the willow tree is not there? Can you live without the willow tree? Well, no, you can't. The willow tree is you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ana Maria, for your great presentation and also for this way to end. I think in a very emotional and moving way, right? I think this for many of us this is a topic close to our hearts, and as I mentioned at the beginning, it's nice to see this community gathering here, working hard to improve the lives of millions of IDPs and forcibly displaced populations worldwide. We have some time for some comments and questions by the audience. If you want to make some questions to Ana Maria, you can maybe raise your hand and we'll open the mic and the camera for you, so that way we have a much better interaction. We also have some audience on YouTube. I think if you post the questions on the channel, we'll get them and we'll relay them to Ana Maria. And maybe to start, Ana Maria, I have a couple of questions while some people have their questions. One question I'm gonna steal from Bjorn. He just asked it in the informal meeting, and also he asked it to Ted yesterday. And can you tell us a little bit about how your research has informed policy? I know that it has, and I think this is something that at least from the JDC, there's a lot of interest in how we can bridge together research and policy components. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about how we as academics can inform research and how to move this forward.
Thank you, Andres. Well, yes, this has been a very long process, but I do believe that the research that we have done in Colombia has informed the process, because we have worked with policymakers since the beginning. So when we started designing this research, even before starting the questionnaires of the surveys and even before starting the hypothesis, we had meetings with the policymakers, and we did not design the surveys and the research separately. It was not this academic research here and the policymakers here, but we did it together. And I think that was very important. It was very important because we addressed the questions of the policymakers, and policymakers have very interesting and important questions that need to be asked, and that can be academically important as well. So the first thing to do that, I do believe, is to have from the beginning a conversation with policymakers and try to have joint efforts to really do research that is policy relevant. An additional thing is to work with policymakers from the beginning, showing the preliminary results of the research, and trying to really see and gauge how the preliminary results of the research have any sense, and to whether it will help them to make decisions. So throughout the research that we have done, we were engaged in all the stages of the process with the policymakers, but also, and very importantly, with victims organization and with other organizations and the international community. So I do believe that doing research without having this first contact makes it much more difficult to then convey the information and to convey the results to policymakers. And yes, I do believe that the research that we have done has been used by the Colombian government, by the Colombian Senate, and by the Colombian Constitutional Court, but not only ours, from many social researchers in social sciences, which I also believe is a very important thing to do, because when we started doing the research in economics of forced displacement, social researchers in Colombia have already done a lot of research on that topic. So it was very important, and we had very heated discussions with policymakers, with social researchers, with international organizations, with our research, and we disagreed, but that was important, I think.
I think that's a very good point that you make. We as economists often get late to many of these topics, and we should pay attention to all the work that has been done previously by other disciplines. And I think Domenico has a nice figure that he's going to show in the concluding session, showing this kind of a dimension and dynamics of research from different disciplines. There's a question from Ninette. Ninette, do you want to come and make your question with your camera on, or should I make it? I don't know if the IT can. Oh yeah. So okay, Ninette, I'll make it. So there's a question, Ana Maria, about how internal displacement has now extended over generations. So at what point does the status of IDP cease and the responsibilities of the state cease? When can we consider that actually they move beyond this IDP status?
Yes, this is a very important discussion that has been held mostly by legal researchers. So we economists have not participated much on this discussion. So you have many ways of deciding when the condition of displaced populations is. So a first thing that it's important is that a person is displaced all his life. I mean, the trauma and what happened is going to be with that person always. So the condition is always going to be there. A person is always going to be an internal displaced person. But what we need to discuss is when special state aid for displaced people is going to cease. The decision of the Colombian government that was embedded since the first legislation in 1997 was that it was going to cease when the displaced were able to achieve, and I'm quoting the law, a socioeconomic stabilization. And this was the decision. And what the law did is this criteria that I showed you at the end of the presentation. And when you need to have, it's at least at least five of these criteria, I think, 5 or 6, I don't remember quite well. Or to have a income 1.5 times above the poverty line. This is the decision, the political decision that Colombia did. Some other governments and some other legislation say that the condition ceases when they go back to their return to their hometown, or when the conditions that generated the displacement in the first place disappeared. But in the Colombian case is when we reach a socioeconomic stabilization.
Thank you, Ana Maria. Thomas again has a question. Can we unmute him?
Am I unmuted?
Oh yeah, you're good.
Awesome. Thank you, Andres and Ana Maria. Thank you so much. This was fascinating and fantastic, this presentation, all your work on this issue. My question is if you have any kind of lessons specifically to the international community. You framed this as, rightfully that refugees can be seen as this, cross-border kind of global public good almost, and IDPs then fall solely under the responsibility of the government. And so just and kind of also juxtaposed against your emphasis on domestic politics and how important those can be. So just wondering kind of your lessons and experience around international actors specifically in the Colombian context, kind of how they've been there, what you think they kind of, where they helped and hurt, and also kind of lessons for other contexts and kind of where you see that more broadly. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Thomas. That's a very important question, I think. In the case of Colombia, the international organizations have been very important. Even though they cannot legally intervene interfere in the decisions of the government. What the international organization did was to help and support the government throughout all this process that I described, through research, through bringing people that knew a lot about the topic, through discussions, and many things. But then what I think the international organization can do is really leave the governments to make their decision, because as I say, this is really a policy and political decision in which the government has to be completely convinced to be successful. But the international organizations can really help by fostering discussion, funding research, policy research, and that is very, it's central, but it has to do with policy, and I think that's important, by bringing people from other countries to share their experiences, and by funding programs. They have funded a lot of programs in Colombia. Those programs have been evaluated through impact evaluation and other types of evaluation. So all these trial and error process of programs in Colombia, the international organizations have been crucial for that. So by providing technical support and by helping governments to build capacity, they are very important. And I hope they continue to do so, because sometimes they are like the thread that connects each government. Because sometimes governments are very different on their priorities and what they think and what they need to do. So even though it's not the same as refugees, they do play a very important role for us. And sorry, I forgot to mention something. And also they support a lot of organizations, victims organizations, the international communities, and build their capacity as well.
You know, Maria and Thomas, I don't see some other questions, so I might join with an additional questions. After seeing all this experience that you have, and you've covered like many different topics that are not being studied at different settings. So what do you think are the gaps in our knowledge to contribute from research and also to inform policymaking in terms of finding these durable solutions to forced displacement?
That's a very difficult question, Andres, but I think there are several gaps that would be interesting to understand. The first one is return. We don't know, very few migrants, either refugees or displaced, want to return. But we need to understand who wants to return and how can we foster a sustainable return process. That is not easy. I mean, when people return to their place of origin, they arrive and they are almost like migrants arriving to a place that is very different from what they had before. The second is the one that we were discussing in the informal meeting a few minutes ago, last hour, and it's about education. So what do we need to do about education for older children and young adolescents? These are children that have faced a lot of traumatic events, and these are children that many times and oftentimes they have to drop out of school. So the transmission of the intergenerational transmission of the consequences for displacement might persist for these children. So we need to really understand which are the integral interventions that we need to do for these children. Not only provide them access to school, which has proven to be insufficient, but what else can we do for them to stay at school and to be individuals that are satisfied with their life and happy and see a good future. The third one that I think is very important and that we as economists have problems studying is the complementarities between the different types of programs, because we evaluate usually one program, which is easier to evaluate because it's just one program. But what we think it's important is to have for IDPs, programs that address several dimensions. So that's why I like Arlene's paper very much, because this is one program that had an impact on a lot of dimensions. And we need to understand how the different programs for IDPs and for refugees complement each other. As I mentioned in the conclusion, how psychosocial support may complement labor training and all those type of things. I do believe we need to understand a little bit more about that. And the political economy of forced displacement and forced and IDP policy.
Thank you. There's a question in the chat by Melissa. Melissa, do you want to come on? We can unmute you for you to make the question. Or you're saying, please feel free to ask. So Melissa's asking, so the restitution component of the victims law is clearly pioneering, but it's taking a long time to implement and still has a long way to go. In what ways has the response implementation been inappropriately slow, in your opinion?
That's a very important question, and that's why I talk a lot about the law being overly ambitious. The restitution part, especially land restitution, has been very slow, and it has been very slow because we didn't have in place the institutions to do the restitution process. And the first one is the judges that knew about agricultural land rights law. So we had to put in place all that to start doing the judicial sentences to restitute the land. So it has been quite slow, and it has been quite slow because of that. But also because it has faced a lot of political opposition to that. So in that sense, I'm not sure, we still have to wait. It started quite slow, but it has been picking up lately, and I'm hopeful that it's going to increase in the following years, but you're right that it has been too slow. And I do believe it's because of institutional capacity, of the difficulty of doing it. In Colombia, we didn't have a good registry. Most of the land was informal, most of that land. So it has been a difficult process, and it's going to continue being so. If we are successful, it's going to be great because we are going to be, we will have put in place very good institutions for protecting land rights.
Thank you, Ana Maria. We're running up to the point. We need to switch to the final discussion. I don't see any other questions. I want to thank you for your presentation. I think it's very comprehensive, and as you mentioned, I truly hope that that it provides lessons for researchers and policymakers that are grappling with displacement in other settings. On a personal note, I want to thank again the JDC and especially Bjorn and Tuan, who invited us to contribute and participate in this conference, because at some point the experience of Colombia has been somewhat ignored or maybe under the table for many other people who have been studying this. And I think there's a lot of lessons that you actually helped craft, and that you have been inspiring other researchers, not only in economics, but also in other disciplines to study this. So thank you, Ana Maria, and thank you all, and we'll see you just in, well, right now for the closing remarks. So Bjorn, the floor is yours.